Hello class and welcome to week 11. We are so close, we are almost there. You all have one last assignment, your film rhetorical analysis. Please do look at Blackboard under course materials and under video lecture. Make sure you watch the video lecture on film rhetorical analysis and look at the materials, the links that I've given you to resources about how to structure and write a film rhetorical analysis, as well as a sample film rhetorical analysis from Purdue University. Be sure to look at all of those. Under course materials, film rhetorical analysis, the film rhetorical analysis video lecture under video lectures on Blackboard. And most importantly, please read the prompt very carefully. The prompt is under assignments on Blackboard, okay? So I just uploaded all that yesterday. Please be sure to take a look at all of that, all right? Before you start outlining and before you even pick a film, okay? Be sure to look at all those materials. Now, again, that is due on December 18th. It's December 1st as I'm filming this right now. So you have almost 3 weeks. So do think carefully about choosing a film and do really review all of those materials before beginning to outline and beginning to draft, and even before picking a film, before doing any work on your film rhetorical analysis, okay? All right, so last week I spoke about, last week I spoke about syllogisms and some elements of argumentation. Syllogisms and assumptions. Examining syllogisms and examining assumptions. And this was all intended for you to be able to uncover your own biases in your own writing when you can conduct your own arguments, construct your own arguments, and be able to identify the biases and the structure of the argument in other authors' writing that you read. This will come in really, really handy when you do your film rhetorical analysis, because you will be viewing the film as an argument that the director is making. And so you'll want to really kind of deconstruct that argument by speaking about the use of rhetorical devices. And some of those can be visual, because a film has that visual rhetorical element to it. Okay? Okay. But today I want to talk more about analyzing an argument so that you can analyze the film as an argument and make your argument about how well the director makes their argument using their tools that they have at their disposal, rhetorical devices, whether visual or words, in words spoken, okay? So we'll start with simply identifying the central claim. And this seems to be pretty easy, but sometimes the author is not making an overt argument, and that will be the case with a film. A lot of times they're not necessarily making an overt argument that you should believe this or you should believe that. It's more subtle, and so sometimes the argument is actually harder to identify. So, identifying the central claim. Some questions to ask if you're unsure really what the director is arguing and what their views are, okay? The main claim you want to identify because it reflects the author's purpose, in this case specifically for our purposes, the director's purpose, okay? If you're having difficulty determining what the author is arguing for or against, or trouble determining the position that the film takes on any issue that it takes up, ask yourself, what does the author want me to think or do with the information that they've given me? And how does the author feel about this issue? First of all, as you're picking a film, you need to decide what issue this film takes up. Does this film take up race relations, gay rights, class, the issue of class, right? The issue of wealth and poverty. What issue is this film taking up? Is it taking up gender roles? There are any number of social issues that a film could decide to comment on in any given moment of time when the issue is pressing. This specific social issue is pressing, right? A lot of these, like the ones I just mentioned, never really go away. So it's normally some new event or debate that really raises it to the forefront again, whatever issue it is, okay? So first you would want to decide what issue the film is deciding to, what issue the author has decided or director has decided to comment on. And then ask yourself, how does the director feel about this issue? And what will help you even more with your analysis is the next question: how can you tell? How can you tell how the director feels about this particular issue? And we used the events of 9/11 as sort of giving birth to Christopher Nolan's version of Batman. It changed our idea of what a hero is. The events of 9/11 changed America's idea of what is good and what a hero is and what America is. And of course, Batman has long been a defender of America. And so for a post 9/11 world, Christopher Nolan altered what Batman was as a hero and what values Batman conveys through his actions, okay? And what is good and what is bad in a post 9/11 world. So that was an example. We looked at how Christopher Nolan might feel about nationalism, about the events of 9/11, about America, and about heroism, okay? That was an example. So if you're a little fuzzy on that, go back and review the notes and review the video lecture for the example that we spent quite a bit of time on in the film rhetorical analysis video lecture. Okay? Okay. Examining and identifying explicit premises and evidence. So we went over in quite a bit of detail what a premise is, what a warrant is, what grounds are, what a claim is, major and minor premises. And we mentioned that not all of the premises that the author is operating under are explicit. Some of them are implicit. So some of them you have to sort of dig to uncover. They're not, the author doesn't directly state because they, most times because they assume that their audience already understands the premise and that the audience already agrees with the premise, so it doesn't need to be stated, okay? So some are explicit and some are implicit. But how to go about identifying them? How to go about identifying these parts of the author's argument so that you can really understand how the author conveyed their argument through the use of rhetorical devices, visual and spoken. You want to separate the persuasive language from the actual claims and truth and fact of the situation. In analyzing evidence, it helps to have an idea of the different types of evidence there are out there. So you all are pretty, know these pretty well, the different types of evidence. But we'll just review real quickly here. Then you can classify the facts into what type of evidence they belong to. So some of the most common types of evidence that directors or writers, any kind of author will present are numbers, specific data, right? Statistics fall under this group, and that's all factual evidence that appeals to logos. Names, so expert opinion, the names of experts or the names of organizations that deal with this issue, or specialized knowledge, the author's own knowledge, okay? So these are some of the different types of evidence that you'll look for, and they show up even in film, It's important when you're analyzing the author's argument that you assess whether the author, in this case the director, has provided the appropriate type of evidence for the type of claim that they are making. Okay? So, in any given situation, statistics might not work best at supporting the argument. Sometimes an appeal to emotion works better and is more persuasive, right? Sometimes instead of expert opinion, statistics are better and more persuasive. So that can be part of, and remember that evidence is a rhetorical tool, a rhetorical device. Providing evidence creates a rhetorical effect in the audience's mind. So you want to analyze the author's use of evidence in terms of, is this the best kind of evidence for the specific kind of claim that the author is making, the director is making, and for the specific audience that they are trying to appeal to. All right? More other different kinds of evidence, individual stories or examples. This is called anecdotal evidence. And this is one specific person's individual experience, right? And is generally a negative or critical term, suggesting that the evidence is not representative. Because it is an individual experience, it is not representative of the issue at large as the general population experiences it. Okay? So for that reason, it's sometimes weaker evidence. All right? Maybe not representative because the sample size is one person. But they can be useful at persuading someone. And just think of when you ask your friend, hey, what kind of shampoo to use? What kind of dishwashing detergent do you use? What kind of, any kind of product? And you might be inclined to try something based on one of your friend's individual experiences with that product. Okay? So these anecdotes can be very successful at persuading an audience, even though they're not the most solid support. You could easily begin to deconstruct that support and create an argument against it. But especially in marketing and advertising, we know that individual experiences matter a lot. Okay? And in a film where we get mostly one individual's experiences, most films are told through one individual's eyes, this can also be very persuasive, anecdotal evidence. Okay. Physical details. So things that you see, hear, and touch. Okay. Dialogue. Direct reporting of what has been seen and heard. Okay. Underneath individual anecdotal evidence. Then there is documentary evidence, including letters, diaries, unpublished writings, laws, administrative policies, court decisions, speeches, interviews, and other statements by relevant people. So documentation as evidence, documentary evidence. Now, the explicit premises are less difficult to identify, but implicit premises are harder to identify because the director assumes that you already agree with them and that they don't need to be stated. And for that reason, they can often fly under the radar and elude your notice, elude you noticing them, right? They will go unnoticed because they're so commonplace or so commonly believed to be true that you don't examine them as a premise, because it's part of our belief system already, entrenched in our belief system already, okay? Identifying implicit reasons will do a combination of two things. It will state, clarify, and make obvious. Bless me. My allergies are getting bad right now with the change of the seasons and the cold weather. It will state, clarify, and make obvious the logical reasons, logical principles that connect the explicit reason to the claim. And this is how you will be able to speak about the weakness or soundness of the claim in general. And in so doing, we usually state and clarify and make obvious the cultural principles or values that connect explicit reason to the claim. So this is really exactly what this entire semester is about, is identifying the values and beliefs that an author has, that they are arguing for. And often they are implicit and reflect a larger cultural bias and a larger cultural attitude and belief, right? So we're always trying to identify the author's assumptions and biases and their values and beliefs when we're evaluating the argument. So identifying the implicit premise helps to do that, because it uncovers the cultural principles and values and beliefs that connect the explicit reason to the claim that the director is making, director or author, okay? Got my peppermint mocha. Secondly, identifying the implicit reason may reveal flaws and inconsistencies in the director's or author's argument. You may find, for example, that simply locating and clearly stating the implicit reason disproves the argument or invalidates the argument. So look for this in the film, and look for this in the director's reasoning and their implicit assertions. Often, when you identify an implicit premise, you uncover what the director is assuming about their audience, because what is implicit, they don't state because they assume their audience already believes this to be true. Okay? It reflects a larger cultural belief or value system and a larger cultural principle. Okay? But sometimes, if we examine the implicit premises, we will invalidate the entire argument. Okay? For this reason, sometimes simply analyzing an argument leads to directly to evaluating it. Once you've taken it apart, it may be obvious why it does not work. Okay? Normally, implicit reasons are where we locate the logic of the argument, the logical connection between the explicit reason that is stated and the claim. And it's also found, implicit premises are found in key assumptions and in context. The when, where, and why. Who does what? Assumptions often infer values. This is what we're really trying to uncover. And values are often dependent on context. Authors and directors will use rhetorical devices to promote their values and beliefs, their value and belief system. In any film, the director conveys to their audience what they believe is good and what they believe is bad. What is the director arguing is good, and what is the director arguing is bad? What does the director want us to avoid, and what does the director want us to do? Okay? How does the author's use of rhetorical devices convey implicit values and beliefs of America if it's an American film, or Korean if it's a Korean film, or Japanese if it's a Japanese film, or South African if it's a South African film? You get the point, okay? Evaluating evidence, continuing on. Is it sufficient? Is it credible? Is it accurate? Always ask yourself those three things. Am I buying what the director is selling? Am I buying into the message? Who or what is the source of the evidence? You want to determine that. It is important to determine the credentials of the person or group responsible for the evidence. And depending upon where the evidence is found, it may be fairly easy to do so. For example, if the evidence is published in an academic journal article, then the evidence is most likely credible because of both the person and people responsible for writing the article, a scholar or scholars in the field, as well as the journal that published it, which is responsible for reviewing and fact-checking the claims made in the article through a peer review process, okay? The author or author's credentials likely will be found in the article at the beginning or the end, the journal of the journal article, and the journal's credentials will be found on the journal's website, so you can easily check that. And we were talking about reviewing a director's credentials, maybe looking at interviews with them. Sources, anytime a director has a new film coming out, sources always interview them on their upcoming film. So there's that as evidence. And looking into their background, where they're from, where they went to school, how old they are, their political affiliation, what is their gender, what is their sexual orientation, what is their religious beliefs, etc., etc., etc. All those things, all those details that form our system of beliefs and values, contribute to it, okay? Kind of sustain it and create it. Is the evidence found in a primary or secondary source? Primary source, of course, is the original source, like a literary work, the film that you're watching, historical document, photo, etc. Whereas a secondary source provides content that has already been interpreted and thus is a step or steps removed from the original. So this would be if you're reading in an academic journal a review of a film, of the film that you're going to analyze. Film scholars write analyses over films and publish them in academic journals. So if you read one of these analyses by a film scholar over the film that you are going to write your film rhetorical analysis over, this would be a secondary source because all the information you're getting from that film scholar is an interpretation of the film that you have chosen. And so it's a secondary source that's already been filtered through that film scholar's brain. And so it's a secondary source. All the information the film conveys has been interpreted by this film scholar and not by you, okay? But it can be helpful to read someone else's interpretation to kind of jump off of. Whether you agree or disagree or it raises other questions can be helpful, okay? So I encourage reading some other analyses over the film that you choose. That would be a good thing to do. If for nothing else, you'll get kind of the structure of a film rhetorical analysis, okay? Depending on the scope of the project and the focus of the argument that you're making, primary sources may be needed more than secondary sources and vice versa. And you'll know what kind of sources you need based on the work that you're doing, right? How does the evidence from one source compare with the evidence from another source? Particularly for academic writing, arguments are generally supported by evidence found in multiple sources. It's important to consider how evidence may or may not represent a pattern across sources and the implications of that for the argument being made. So, how does this director's view over whatever social issue they're taking up differ from analysts, from other people who have analyzed the problem and work in that public sector, right? Might be government sources, social workers, if it's class or race, how did the director's views differ from the research or align with the research that's been done about this social issue already by the academic professionals, okay? How current is the evidence? Or how old is this film? Generally, you'll want the evidence to be up to date as possible, particularly in areas such as science, health, medicine, and technology that can evolve quickly. Now, some films are really great for looking back at because they show that we have, as a society, have not advanced in tackling a certain problem. I'm trying to think of a great example, and it's not coming to me right now. But if you, this is not a film, but if you go back and listen to I Have a Dream, it really brings into focus the kind of work that we as a society need to do concerning race relations and how far we have come and how far we still have to go. So some films are like that. They take up an issue. They may have taken it up in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. But if you watch it again today, you can still see how far we have left to go and how far we've come. Okay? So that's helpful when you're speaking about evidence that's older. In some cases, if evidence from even just 2 years ago, evidence from just 2 years ago may be outdated, whereas in other cases, the evidence may have a longer shelf life. So some films from just a couple of years ago have really not aged well given the cultural context. And so that's something to pay attention to too. Even in a year, a film may look different to an audience than it did a year before. Certainly, the event COVID and this pandemic changes the way we view films like Outbreak that came out decades ago. For some of you who haven't seen it, it's just a film about an outbreak of a deadly disease. But there are many, many films about infectious diseases that and breakouts, infectious diseases and pandemics like we're having. And certainly living it, we view those films differently now. And we understand what they have to tell us in the argument that they're making differently now. So that could be really interesting for you to choose a film about an infectious disease like Outbreak. It was very famous when it came out. Did very well at the box office. And there are many others. That's just one that pops into my head. But films like that would be a very interesting rhetorical analysis for your choice for your film rhetorical analysis, because of current events that change the way that we as a society would view it and the values and beliefs attached to it, to that film. Okay? All right. More evaluating evidence. Is the evidence that the director provides specific enough for the situation? Does it ultimately support the claim? Sometimes tangential evidence may be all that is available, or circumstantial evidence that's sort of flimsy to, at the time, to back a reason or reasons that the author presents in their argument. But almost always evidence should be specific to the reasons and claim, not merely related tangentially. It should be directly correlated, right? There should be a clear and obvious connection. Okay. So does the director connect those dots for you? Clearly enough. Why is the evidence important to the argument? Generally, when making an argument, there are many choices to be made, including what evidence from the range of evidence available to you is best to include, and what kind of evidence, right? Especially what kind of evidence. Consider whether and why the evidence has been provided and why you are considering and that you are considering using is necessary to the argument. Okay? Why is the evidence that the director presents necessary to their argument? What does the evidence perhaps suggest, but not explicitly show? In order to develop a strong argument, it's necessary to consider possible different interpretations of the evidence. The director most definitely will present evidence to you that backs their claim, that you will interpret differently than other people who watch the film, and that you will interpret differently than the director does, right? And address those as needed. Address those instances as needed. What is interesting about the evidence that will catch the attention of the viewer or reader and make it memorable? In some cases, evidence that states the obvious may be necessary, but often argument is more complex than that and therefore requires more engaging evidence. All right. Identifying logical fallacies. We don't really have time this semester to do an entire video lecture on logical fallacies, but I will post a list of them so that you're able to identify them. I think if you familiarize yourself with them and read through that list, you will be able to spot them relatively easy. Identifying flaws in reasoning by spotting logical fallacies. Identifying the argument's claims, step 1, and underlying assumptions, evaluate their quality. Think of as many alternative explanations and counterexamples as you can, step 2. Step 3, think of what specific additional evidence might weaken or support the claims that the director is making. Step 4, ask yourself what changes in the argument would make the reasoning more sound. Okay. Identifying the counter argument. Good arguments identify and address the counter argument. So if you can identify a point in the film where the director does this, then whether it's through dialogue or however the director chooses to do this, then that is a really good thing, a really positive thing, a very astute analysis. So look to try to do that. I find that students sometimes have trouble if I give them a short essay that's 3 pages. Sometimes they have trouble identifying exactly where the author has refuted the claims of the objection. People that would argue against and tell the author that they're wrong, what kind of argument they would come up with to refute the claims of the author. I find that students have trouble finding the specific place in articles where the author addresses the arguments that people might make against them, right? Or the counter-argument. Okay, so does the author address the counter-argument? What are counter-arguments you can think of or discover that might refute the director's point of view or their argument, their interpretation that they are promoting and arguing for? Why treat the counter-argument fairly and objectively? For one, credibility. Mentioning the counter-argument gives you and your argument credibility. It shows that you have done your research, proving you are an open-minded individual and worthy of respect. Rounding the argument. Another important part of proving your point is showing why your argument is valid. If you spend an entire essay reiterating that your point is important, the reader might see that, sure, this is what the writer thinks, but if you don't show why your point of view is better than anyone else's, they might not be persuaded, or they may not understand why you're arguing that point, why it's necessary to argue this point. You have to prove to your audience that there are those out there that would disagree with you, and so it is necessary to be arguing this point. Which goes back to when I spoke about how to write a successful thesis statement, a solid thesis statement. You have to make sure that it is one that someone might disagree with, reasonably disagree with. A thesis statement needs to be arguable. And so you need to find the director's thesis statement and imagine who might reasonably disagree with the director's thesis statement. Okay? You can also, by identifying the counter-argument and addressing the counter-argument, neutralize the opposition. You can weaken the opposition by addressing their points before they get an opportunity to voice them. You are addressing them on your own terms by bringing them to the surface before the opposition has a chance to counter, right? A counter argument makes a kind of preemptive strike. You're going on the offense, identifying problems with your arguments before others point them out to you. Recognize the limitations of your arguments. By beginning in the counter argument, you are telling the reader or audience that you know what others might say about you and that you're prepared for it, because you understand the case that the opposition has, and you've considered it and found that you don't agree with it, but not before considering it. You have rationally, reasonably considered it and formed an opinion after that based on reason and analyzation. Okay? All right. Now, there are three last topic we'll go over today. There are three ways to identify premises, because it can be tricky. Identify premises and conclusions. It can be tricky. The three methods. First, of course, is persuasion. The first method is to ask yourself, and it's good to use all three of these throughout the film that you're watching or the argument that you're reading. The first method is to ask yourself, what does the author really want me to believe? I know that the author is throwing all these facts at me and saying all this stuff, but if I told the author to shut up and get to the point, what would they say? What is it they really care about if they had to summarize their argument in one sentence? If you had to summarize the film in one sentence, what would it be? The director's argument. What is it the director or author really wants to persuade me of? The answer to all those questions should be the same. It should be the conclusion that the author wants you to come to on your own, or director. Now, of course, this method relies a bit on your intuition. You can definitely get this wrong. You have to intuitively know what's being supported as good and what's being not supported as bad. What's giving support and generally understand what the passage is saying. Okay? Why should I believe what the director is telling me? The second method involves trial and error. Take the sentence that you think might be the conclusion and ask yourself, why is this true? Why do I believe it? What reasons has the director given you to accept this conclusion as valid? Try to answer that question by referring to other instances in the film or other instances in the passage or article. If those sentences give you a satisfactory answer to why you should believe the conclusion that the author wants you to come to, that they state, then you may have found the conclusion. Or if not, you might want to continue asking these questions and continue analyzing and thinking about what the conclusion might be. The third is indicators. Good authors and good directors will signal to you, hey, I'm making a claim here. Hey, I'm making an argument here. Hey, here's my conclusion, through their language. And of course, language is still part of a film because dialogue. So good authors and directors will signal to you that they are making these rhetorical moves through the use of specific language. Okay? The third method is very mechanical for this reason. It includes indicators, which are words. is a very mechanical method which utilizes your understanding of conclusion or premise indicators. These are words whose role in the English language is to indicate support structure. Even if the above two methods work well for you, familiarize yourself with these words to check to see if you have done step 1 and 2 correctly and analyze the situation correctly. Or the author's argument, director's argument correctly. Words or phrases usually followed by the conclusion. Consequently, therefore, as a result, so clearly, it follows that accordingly, we may conclude, it entails. Hence, thus, we may infer that, it must be that, and implies that. This is why words or phrases usually followed by a premise or premises. Given that, seeing that, for the reason that, owing to, as indicated by, after all, on the grounds that, that last one even uses the words grounds, which we talked about as part of our video lecture on syllogisms. Words or phrases usually followed by premises, but also contain the conclusion, for, since, or because. Okay? So use each one of these 3 methods: persuasion, belief, and indicators, to identify conclusions and premises. And from there, you can evaluate how well the author or director has utilized rhetorical devices to support and convey their conclusion and their premises, okay, to their audience. Their specific audience at this specific time, given their specific subject matter, okay? So that is all I have for you today. I'm continuing on evaluating an argument from last week's video lecture. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. Hang in there for Christmas break. I know this Christmas might be a little different, but I hope that you still are able to celebrate safely. And I will see you next week.